The first 100 days of the New Deal saw much success, albeit on a smaller scale. Following Roosevelt's initial bank holiday, banks were reopened and runs on banks where people withdraw all their money had stopped as the people slowly regained confidence in financial institutions. This is not to say that many had not lost all their savings. Unemployment was dropping and relief payments were getting to the poor. The farmers likewise were receiving help and businesses were stabilizing. When one looks at government economic policy, one can divide it into two groups: a nationally planned economy where markets are administered, and an economy with little or no government involvement, the laissez-faire model. Today, China would be an example of a controlled economy where the government dictates what and how much is made, although there is a more free market element in the last 20 years in China. The United States, although nominally a capitalistic nation, does have some controls on the economy, and many of these date to the New Deal. When we look at the New Deal, we see that FDR's programs lean towards fomenting a national policy for the country. Capitalism has its normal cycles of boom, prosperous times, and then bust, recession. But the Great Depression was a bust unlike any other. Focusing on the immediate reason for the Depression, the Wall Street crash, Roosevelt moved to establish government control of the financial system. The Securities Exchange Act of 1934 established the Securities Exchange Commission that regulates the buying and selling of stock. Importantly, it established a margin requirement where buyers had to put up a greater percentage of money to buy stock. The Communications Act of 1934 established the Federal Communications Commission that regulates market, telegraph and cable communications. Today, the FCC regulates television, the internet and social media platforms. As government control increased, the New Deal developed enemies on both the left and the right. With the passage of New Deal legislation, the old system of operating was being done away with as the government established greater control. Opposition came from both ends of the political spectrum, the conservative right and the liberal left. The conservative right was led by big business. As in the era of industrialization, big business opposed government intervention as it cut into profits. Roosevelt administration came under attack from fellow Democrats in the guise of the American Liberty League, who, like big business, were pro-laissez-faire. In the 1930s, in response to the growth of communism, National Socialism had taken root in many countries, and American National Socialist movements saw communism, Jewish influence, behind the New Deal. As if attacks from the right weren't bad enough, the New Deal came under attack from the left also. Leading the charge were the communists who saw a chance to overthrow American capitalism. Agitators took to the streets, and years later it would come to pass that FDR's administration was riddled with communist spies. Father Charles Coughlin, who became known as the radio priest because of his radio addresses, at first supported the New Deal, but as he saw Jewish influence increasing, he turned against it. Francis Townsend appealed to the older members of the population who promised money to people over 60. But perhaps FDR's greatest threat came from Huey Long from Louisiana, who would be what we call today a populist. Long wanted more money in the hands of the people and came up with the Share Our Wealth plan, where every family got 5,000. Every man a king became the rallying cry. Long was elected a senator and became a political threat to FDR and was looking at a run for president. His assassination was convenient, removing a threat to Roosevelt. Labour Union leaders who wanted more also opposed FDR's plan, as did the Jungle author Upton Sinclair. These movements against the New Deal were strong and scared Roosevelt, particularly the rise of Huey Long. To stay politically strong, he needed to move to the left or to the right. In his State of the Union address in 1935, he announced his intention of moving to the left and increasing government control in the economy. This became the Second New Deal. The Second New Deal programs are listed here. You can go through them. The Emergency Relief Appropriations Act put $5 billion aside for the Works Progress Administration. Lots of public works were undertaken, but critics allege that many of these projects were work for the sake of work. Roads that led to nowhere, airfields for no planes, bridges over no rivers. These were called boondoggles. Rural areas were also catered to too, with the Resettlement Administration, which resettled farmers to better land, and the Rural Electrification Administration, which by 1941 had provided 40% of all farms with electricity. The first three acts in this slide are the most important. The National Labour Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, the Social Security Act, and the Banking Act. The Wagner Act helped strengthen labour unions. Membership grew from 3 million in 1933 to 9 million in 1939, and the United Automobile Workers Union was formed. Social Security is possibly the most lasting legacy of the New Deal, a government pension fund paid into by employees and employers. The Banking Act further increased the power of the Federal Reserve in controlling the supply of money. Today, for example, because the economy has slowed down, the Fed has put lots of dollars in circulation. If inflation kicks in, the Federal Reserve can reduce the money flow and hold prices down. With the Second New Deal being enacted, court cases on earlier New Deal legislation now found themselves before the Supreme Court. A Conservative majority of 5-4 meant that the court ruled against FDR on New Deal cases, on New Deal legislation. This would lead to conflict between the two branches as Roosevelt sought to drive through his legislation with a court-packing plan. It would be seen as an attempt to undermine the principles of the Constitution and would ultimately tarnish his legacy. The first two cases that found New Deal legislation unconstitutional were Schechter versus United States and United States versus Butler. Aspects of the legislation, like government interference in intrastate or within a state commerce, to be unconstitutional. The federal government has jurisdiction over interstate, between states, not intrastate commerce. Disappointed by these setbacks, Roosevelt was nevertheless riding a wave of popularity, which was reflected in his 1936 election win, where he captured 523 out of 531 electoral votes. The password today is dead duck. Roosevelt's landslide win in 1936 had been built on the support of immigrants, labour and blacks, all of whom had benefited from New Deal policies. With his resounding victory in 1936, he felt confident in taking on the Supreme Court of the United States, which had ruled against the New Deal in 7 out of 9 cases. Immigrants were processed through the Democratic Party machines and voted for the party. The unions had benefited under FDR and voted accordingly, and blacks in the post-Civil War voted for the Democratic Party, giving rise to the term the Solid South. Armed with this electoral mandate, Roosevelt decided to take on America's highest court. In 1937, he submitted a plan to Congress to reorganize the Supreme Court, using the excuse that the court was too old to keep up with the workload. His real reason was to replace the conservative justices with more liberally minded ones who would support New Deal legislation. As it stood, the 5 conservative justices outvoted the Liberals 5-4. The plan was to add a judge for every current judge that didn't retire at 70. The new judges, of course, being of the liberal persuasion. Ultimately, FDR hoped to increase the number from 9 to 15 to get his New Deal legislation passed. The backlash was swift. Roosevelt was accused of trying to gain dictatorial powers with his court-packing plan. To the political class, it was an attempt to undermine the constitutional system of checks and balances. For all his popularity, the people were concerned with the government gaining too much power. In the end, circumstances intervened, even as the Senate refused to pass the bill. A conservative justice, William Van Devanter, announced his retirement, allowing FDR to replace him with a liberal. The Chief Justice, Charles Evan Hughes, argued that the court was up to date on its work. And finally, the Supreme Court started ruling New Deal legislation to be constitutional. The Wagner Act and the Social Security Act were two laws they ruled on and found to be constitutional. In 1937, in a compromise, the Judicial Procedure Reform Act was passed that saw no new justices added, and the judicial procedure of ruling on cases speeded up. This attempt to gain more power for the executive branch at the expense of the judicial tarnished Roosevelt's legacy. Politically, it hurt the Democrats, as they lost 72 seats in the following congressional elections of 1938. To compound the problems of rural America during the 1930s, on the Great Plains a dust bowl occurred. Overcultivation, coupled with arid conditions, turned the soil into dust. The states affected were Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado, Kansas, New Mexico, and it led to the migration of 300,000 people to California in search of work. John Steinbeck's classic, The Grapes of Wrath, tells of this great migration of people and how they were treated in the West. I highly recommend it. The map shows the Dust Bowl on the Great Plains. In the late 1930s, further New Deal legislation was passed. Numbers 1 and 2 applied to farmers, that is the Bankhead-Jones Farm Tenant Act and the Second Agricultural Adjustment Act, and helped them with low interest loans in buying land. The AAA here put quotas on crops to prevent overproduction, but provided storage for farmers to hold the crops until prices came back down. The temporary National Economic Committee set up hearings to study the effects of monopolies and recommended further antitrust procedures. The Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act was more stringent than the Pure Food and Drug Act. And lastly, the Fair Labour Standards Act established a federal minimum wage. In 1937-1938, Roosevelt slowed government spending in an attempt to balance the budget and give business a breathing spell. Unfortunately, with the less government spending, the economy once more slid into recession, and the administration was forced back into deficit spending or prime the pump economics. In 1938, the unemployment rate remained at a stubborn 10.6%, and it would be World War II that took the United States out of the Great Depression. Please answer the following questions in the relevant place. If you need more time on each slide, please pause the video and answer the questions. That ends our lecture for today. Thank you for your time and participation. Thank you.